Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about the nature of the form in which Guy de Maupassant has chosen to write. What we have in the Orla is a series of journal entries, supposed journal entries, written by the first-person narrator. Whenever you have a story that is written in the form of letters, diary entries, or in a contemporary context, emails or blog posts, you're dealing with what is known as an epistolary narrative. Epistle simply means letter. So if I was to write a letter to someone, if I was to send an email to somebody, that would be an epistle. The epistolary form, or an epistolary narrative, is a story that takes the shape or the form of, well, a series of letters or a series of blog posts or the like. These texts are typically concerned with the expression of a kind of psychological realism because, on the one hand, you get the innermost intimate thoughts of the character, and on the other, you can see the developing consciousness of this character over time. What I'd like you to do is to take a look at this series of questions on your own. First, in an epistolary story, the text that we hold in our hands is a physical object inside the story, letters or a diary. Generally, how does the epistolary form affect our reading of the story and the factors that we have to consider when reading it? Now, on the one hand, you could say in answer to this question, well, we're dealing with a first-person narrative, so we're getting the innermost thoughts of the character. And that's true, but think about this. These stories are supposedly a diary of a narrator, letters that are being sent by the narrator, or a series of newspaper articles. Think about these different kinds of epistolary narratives. What changes in how we read these stories? How does that affect, or how does the nature of the text that we're engaging with actually impact our response to it and what we have to think about when we're reading it? What do we actually have to consider when I'm reading an epistolary story versus a standard first-person novel? What changes between the two? Or if I have an epistolary text and it is letters, how is that different from one that is a diary? What new factors or things do I have to take into consideration based on the fact that these are physical objects inside the story? Or put it into a contemporary context. What if they're emails or blog posts? How do these things influence the way I have to grapple with the text and the specific kind of epistolary narrative that it is? Secondly, what is the effect of the epistolary form on the Orla specifically? How does it impact our interpretation of the novella? And does it contribute to the terror that Maupassant attempts to inspire? Think about how Maupassant is using the epistolary form. Was there a reason that he chose to use it? Or would have been exactly the same thing had he chosen to use simply the first person narrative and not have it as a series of diary entries? Why do you think he made that choice? What impact does it have on the potential for the creation of certain specific feelings in this story? And lastly, why might the narrator be so interested in recording these events in epistolary form while his life and sanity are under threat? In horror tales, we often have the narrator speaking to us and saying something like, I can hear this creature clawing at the doors. It's tearing down the door now. And then he descends into this little oblivion of ellipses. Right? In one of these stories, when we are presented with a first-person narrator who's speaking, let's say, perhaps in the present tense, we can understand that we're getting a direct access to his mind. But here, the narrator is actually taking the time to sit down and write something in his journal to describe these horrifying events when he's saying, I'm so desperate to get out of this house and I can't escape. Why? Why is he taking the time to do this? Why is he recording these things in epistolary form? Take about 15 minutes on your own to think about answers to these questions. Grapple with them, engage with the text, think about it. Practice on your own as a way of familiarizing yourself with this work in anticipation of future assignments. And then when you're done, return to this video and we'll go over some of my suggested responses to these questions. All right, with respect to that first question, think about the differences between an epistolary novel that is written in the form of a diary and those that are written in the form of letters. When you have a diary, for instance, there's a presumption that this is intimate, it's personal, it's something that you're recording for yourself. So what you leave down is going to, and how you convey it to yourself is going to be different than how you would convey these ideas to somebody else. You never anticipate that this is going to be revealed to somebody else, so you might be more intimate in your disclosures in this text. Or they might be point form notes. You believe that you can remember what you're going to say or what has happened. You believe that you can remember what you've done. And so all you need are short, small reminders. of what happened at a specific time. If it's a diary, you might be concerned that the diary is going to be read, so you might leave salient details out. If it's a letter, for instance, the recipient of your letter determines its contents and its tone. So if this novel is in the epistolary form, in the form of letters specifically, then suddenly I'm going to tailor the way in which I write this letter to my audience. I don't write the same way to a student, let's say, as I do to my mother or father. It's fundamentally different in tone and subject and material that I'm comfortable disclosing and discussing. So when you're looking at an epistolary novel, you always have to think about who is writing this, what the purpose of this character inside the fiction has, or what purpose the character inside the fiction has in writing this letter. To whom is it addressed? What does this person want from the recipient of the letter? How is he changing or altering the tone and contents of the letter in order to best suit his purposes in relation to that other person? There's also the reality that these are physical objects in the world of the fiction. So if you have a diary, maybe you have this massive section that is left out, and indeed that does happen when the narrator in the Horla goes on vacation. He doesn't take the diary with him. He leaves it at home and doesn't have any entries for an entire month while he's on vacation. Likewise, if you're writing a letter, that letter could be lost in the mail or it could be delayed. And if the novel itself is a series of letter exchanges between two individuals, then suddenly, well, you could be responding to a letter that you received and have sent off your response only to receive another letter from this individual that completely changes the context of the message that you sent and makes it invalid. So the letters that are being conveyed back and forth because of the temporal delay in receipt and then sending might in fact change in their nature, their content, their connotations based on new developments. Or they might be damaged in the mail, they might be lost or destroyed. And so the conversation becomes fragmentary. Or you might know that your letters are being opened and read. In the case of the novel Pamela, this woman is taken away by a man who wants to possess her sexually, and she's sort of secreted away from her family, and she's writing letters to her family because she refuses to give in to him. She knows that the letters that are being sent out are going to be read by him. She also knows that the letters that she receives are going to be read by him. And she can't be certain if the letters that she's sending are reaching her parents. And she can't be certain that the letters she's supposedly receiving from her parents are really from her parents. They could be forgeries created by this man who, well, wants to possess her sexually. So what you have here is this complex web of intentionality and manipulation on both characters' parts, because we who only have access to her letters don't know what's going on with the letters that she sends or the letters that she's supposedly receiving. And what she says and how she frames her experiences might be designed to manipulate the man whom she knows is reading her letters. So we can't take them at face value. This series of complex suggestions and possibilities regarding the nature of the form and the implications here for the epistolary form have to be taken into account. And they are signaled by textual elements or aspects of the character's psychology and what they have to say. It's a complex mosaic that we have to piece together in order to better understand the intentionality behind these characters and the influence of the particular form in which these stories are written. In relation to question 2, I would submit that Maupassant chooses to use the epistolary form rather than the simple first person because he can elide certain aspects of the text that wouldn't contribute to the unified emotional experience that he wishes to convey. There's a building sense of dread and terror as the narrator begins to lose his sanity. If we had those moments where he was on vacation and we experienced them, detailed day by detailed day, suddenly you would have a massive chunk of the text that would have to be conveyed for verisimilitude's sake, for realism's sake, because he would record these entries in his diary. But because he left it at home by accident and hasn't kept his diary while he was away on vacation, suddenly Maupassant can justifiably excise all those different elements and aspects that were positive and light that would interrupt the consistent tone that he's trying to create. That would be one of the main reasons that Maupassant chooses to use the epistolary form by way of diary entries. Now, why might the narrator be so interested in recording these events in epistolary form while his life and sanity are under threat? Things to keep in mind here about the nature of a diary. A diary is kind of like an instantiation of ourself. It's a record of our evolving understanding of ourself, of our personhood. The act of writing a journal or a diary is a way to make real and solid our memories and our identity. It's a way of recording who I am, what I did, why I did it, and in doing so, to construct a portrait of yourself that seems enduring and lasting. This is what happened, this is who I am, and here's how the two are related. It fixes that identity in time, and at the same moment, it shows how we're subject to being changed over time. In this way, the form is in a sense self-defeating. At the same moment that we attempt to inscribe our identities, to record who we are in this diary, it also reveals to us the way in which that identity is changing and shifting. The attempt to inscribe our identity in concrete form, to actually record it in this concrete book that we can hold in our hands, demonstrates our inability to maintain a consistent identity over time. It only reveals our change. Now, the narrator grapples with this reality. Remember that his principal concern in this text is that his identity is being displaced by the Orla. He says he's becoming me, he's becoming my very soul, right, on August 14th. His mind is being displaced by this other creature. So one of the reasons that he might be so invested in recording his identity, in recording these events in diary form, is that he's trying to externalize his identity. He's trying to give him something that he can hold on to, that tells him, this is who I am. This is what I am. It's a means of defending the identity and the personhood that are slowly decaying away, either because the Orla is really preying upon him psychically, or because he's losing his mind to madness. But because of that inherent nature of the epistolary form, or because of the inherent nature of the diary as a form, in that it records our changing psychology and our mindset, his project is doomed to fail from the start. Remember that we talked about the narrator's response in horror and our response and the way in which they're parallel. Something similar is going on here now. It's incumbent upon us to parse out meanings, to determine the truth through textual clues that the narrator leaves us. There's ambiguity, there's uncertainty, there's, well, unreliability on the part of the narrator. There are massive gaps in the form because he leaves so much out in those moments when he doesn't have access to his journal, or he's too sick or too defeated to record events in his journal. In the same way that the narrator seeks to know the truth, so too do we. We have to decipher and then neutralize the text's ambiguity, all those questions that it leaves us with, just as he has to do the same with his own life and mind. This story, then, in the use of the epistolary form and its way of playing upon our presumptions, assumptions, and beliefs about the way in which these kinds of stories are supposed to work, the way in which books are supposed to work, establishes a tension between reliability and unreliability. We know that what the narrator tells us in this journal is, in some sense, considered. He always has to think about the day's events before he records them. He chooses what he puts into the diary, and he chooses what he leaves out. So the fictional writer of this journal chooses in deliberate fashion what he reveals and what he conceals. In that sense, it seems like he has control, and that's one of the reasons he's recording this journal. I have control of what I put in and what I leave out. I have control of what I say. It's another way of assuring to himself that he is still in control of who he is still in control of the identity that he claims to possess and that he's trying to record in this journal. I get to define who I am. It's the same thing as we discussed in relation to those scientific experiments that he runs. He's saying, I still have the capacity for reason. I'm not going mad. I can prove it because I can use this logical process of scientific investigation to determine what the Orla is and to prove my sanity or my insanity. It's a means of defending and asserting his sanity. Here, the epistolary form, his decision to write in his journals, because he gets to choose what is put in and what is left out, because he gets to choose who he represents himself to be, is a way of defending and defining his identity, just as he was defending and defining his sanity. And yet, we know that that's far from a perfect dominion. He doesn't actually have control over who he is. He can reveal himself through the subconscious biases in what he leaves out. The very act of self-concealment and deception becomes a revelation of what he wants to conceal or what he wants to fool us into believing. Right? The very fact that, well, he's losing his sanity and he's losing his grip on reality. He's losing his grip on his identity. These things together make him, obviously, as we've already discussed, an unreliable narrator. That unreliability helps to establish the reasonability of the text. His belief that the Orla is an hallucination His attempt to question himself and the validity of what he's seeing makes him more trustworthy. If he just accepted it without any kind of self-doubt, then he would be immediately recognizable as somebody who is untrustworthy, because nobody human, nobody sane would react that way. In his doubt and his skepticism, the narrator establishes a kind of trustworthiness that makes his eventual assertions regarding the inescapable conclusions to which he comes, regarding the supernaturalism of the Orla and its existence, appear all the more valid and reasonable. If he believed that it was real from the outset, if there was no gradual, slow transition from realism to the weird, from disbelief and skepticism to acceptance and horror, well, the violation of natural law would be too quick. It would distance us from him, and it would detract from the emotional experience that Maupassant wants to create. So, things to keep in mind from this video: the nature of the epistolary form, and this idea of the narrator writing in order to try to define his identity through writing, through the recording of everything he's done and why, what he thinks, what he believes. And that, in turn, being utterly self-defeating, because a diary only records the record of your change. It's not something that actually truly instantiates your identity or records it. So his attempt to defend his identity against the consumption of his self, of his personhood by the Orla, is doomed to failure.